My name is Gabrielle and I'm 28 years old. When I was 8, my parents threw me out of our house on a cold October night with nothing but my backpack and stuffed rabbit. That moment shattered my childhood and changed the trajectory of my entire life. I wandered through the darkness, confused and terrified, until my aunt found me huddled in a park and took me in. The journey from that night to where I am today has been long and painful. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you haven't already, please subscribe to hear more stories of survival and healing. Together, we can find strength in our shared experiences. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind where everyone knows each other's business, but somehow nobody notices when something is wrong behind closed doors. Our house was at the end of Maple Street Blue, with white trim, looking perfectly normal from the outside. But inside, it was a different story. My father James worked at the local factory when he wasn't too drunk to show up. He had these massive hands that seemed gentle when he was sober, which wasn't often. His anger was like a storm that could brew from nothing sudden and violent. My mother Diana existed in his shadow, her depression making her almost a ghost in our home. She moved through rooms quietly, trying not to disturb the fragile peace. Then there was my older brother Anthony, 4 years my senior. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my father's eyes. He played baseball, made decent grades, and most importantly, knew how to make himself scarce when Dad's temper flared. I didn't blame him for that. We all had our survival strategies. As a child, I thought our family was normal. I didn't realize that other kids didn't walk on eggshells in their own homes, or that other parents remembered to make lunch for their children. The signs of neglect were there, but I had nothing to compare it to. When I showed up to school in the same clothes 3 days in a row or without a packed lunch, I just said I was picky about my clothes and that I forgot my lunch at home. My most prized possession was a stuffed rabbit named Floppy, with one ear that drooped from years of being clutched tight. Floppy was my confidant, my protector, the one consistent source of comfort in my young life. I would whisper my secrets, fears, and dreams to Floppy when the house grew too quiet or too loud. School was my sanctuary. Inside those walls there were rules that made sense, praise when I did well, and most importantly, warmth. My second-grade teacher, Mrs. Palmer, was the first adult who seemed to really see me. She had this way of touching my shoulder gently when I got something right, and she never raised her voice, not even when Tommy Matthews threw clay across the art room. Mrs. Palmer noticed things. She noticed when I came to school without a coat in winter and quietly found a spare in the lost and found. She noticed when I hoarded the free crackers from lunch, slipping them into my pockets, and instead of calling me out, she started keeping granola bars in her desk for me. I remember my 8th birthday so clearly. Mom had promised a small party, nothing fancy, just cake after dinner. I had even dared to invite Samantha, my friend from next door. Samantha's family was what I imagined normal looked like. Her mom baked cookies and her dad built a treehouse in their backyard. They had Sunday dinners with grandparents and took summer vacations to the beach. On my birthday, I waited at school, excited for Samantha to come over later. But when I got home, there was no cake, no mention of my birthday. Dad was passed out on the couch, and Mom was staring blankly at a television show she wasn't really watching. When I gently reminded her about the party, she looked at me with vacant eyes and said, "Not today, Gabby. Dad's not feeling well." I spent that night in my room with Floppy singing happy birthday to myself. Things got worse after Dad lost his job at the factory. The layoff notice came on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday night he had drained a bottle of whiskey and put his fist through the kitchen wall. His drinking, already bad, became constant. The tenuous financial stability we had enjoyed collapsed, and tension filled every corner of our home. I started to notice Mom hiding money around the house, tucking bills into the pages of books, or taping them under drawers. Dad would tear through the house looking for these hidden reserves when his own funds ran dry. Their arguments grew louder, more frequent, and increasingly frightening. By the time fall came around, our refrigerator was often empty. The heat was kept so low I could see my breath in the mornings, and I had learned to make myself as small and quiet as possible. I became an expert at reading the atmosphere, at detecting the subtle shifts that signaled an impending storm. But even experts make mistakes sometimes. And then came the day that would divide my life into before and after the day when being small and quiet wasn't enough to save me. It was a Thursday. I remember that clearly because we had art class on Thursdays, and I had made a clay pinch pot that I was so proud of. Mrs. Palmer had praised its perfect little shape and the careful way I had smoothed the edges. It sat wrapped in newspaper in my backpack, still damp, but hardening, a gift I hoped might make my mom smile. The morning had started like many others. Dad nursing a hangover at the kitchen table, coffee, and something stronger in his mug. Mom moving silently around him, a dance of avoidance they had perfected over years. I ate my cereal quickly, careful not to let the spoon clink against the bowl. Anthony had already left for school, always eager to escape the tension of the house. "Don't forget your lunch," Mom had said, surprising me as she placed a paper bag in my hands. It had been weeks since she had remembered to make me lunch. Inside was a peanut butter sandwich, slightly stale apple slices, and a small carton of juice. It felt like a peace offering, though I didn't know what she was apologizing for yet. School that day had been unusually good. I got a gold star on my spelling test, and during recess, Samantha had invited me to her birthday party the following weekend. Her mother was making cupcakes with sprinkles, and they were going to have a piñata. I held that invitation like it was made of glass, carefully tucking it into my folder so it wouldn't crease. The walk home from the bus stop was crisp with early October air. The leaves had started to turn, making the trees look like they were on fire in the afternoon sun. I remember thinking that maybe things were looking up. Mom had made me lunch. I had an invitation to a real birthday party, and my pinch pot had turned out perfect. But as I approached our house, I could hear the shouting from the sidewalk. Their voices carried through the partially open windows, Dad's deep and slurred, Mom's high and desperate. I stood frozen, my backpack suddenly feeling too heavy. "Where is it? I know you've been hiding money from me," Dad roared. "We need that for bills, James. The electric company is going to shut us off." Mom's voice cracked with fear and frustration. I should have turned around, then should have gone to Samantha's house or back to school, anywhere but through that front door. But where else could I go? This was my home, broken as it was. I tried to enter quietly, hoping to slip past the kitchen where their voices were concentrated to make it upstairs to my room where I could hide until the storm passed. But the front door creaked, announcing my presence like a betrayal. The fighting paused, a moment of terrible silence, and then Dad's voice, dangerously soft. "Gabrielle, that you?" "Yes, Dad." I called back, my voice small. "Get in here." I walked into the kitchen, clutching my backpack straps tight. The room smelled of whiskey and fear. Dad stood looming over Mom, who sat at the table, her face in her hands. There was a broken plate on the floor, and Mom's purse had been emptied, its contents scattered across the table. "Did your mother give you any money?" he demanded, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "No, sir," I whispered. "Don't lie to me." He slammed his hand on the table, making me jump. "She's been hiding it somewhere, and I'm going to find it." "I don't have any money, I swear," I said, tears beginning to well up. I clutched my backpack tighter, remembering the clay pot inside. Maybe it would still make things better. "I made you something at school today," I offered, my voice trembling as I unzipped my backpack. But in my nervousness, I moved too quickly. As I pulled out the newspaper-wrapped pot, my elbow knocked against the half-empty bottle of whiskey perched on the edge of the counter. It teetered for a heart-stopping moment before crashing to the floor, shattering into a constellation of glass and spilling amber liquid across the linoleum. The silence that followed was absolute. I stared at the spreading puddle, the whiskey seeping into the grout between tiles, knowing what was coming but unable to move. Dad's face transformed rage, twisting his features into something unrecognizable. "You stupid, clumsy girl," he roared, grabbing my arm so hard I dropped my precious pot, which broke alongside the whiskey bottle. "That was the last of it. Do you have any idea how much that cost?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," I sobbed, trying to pull away from his painful grip. "James, she didn't mean it." Mom finally spoke up, but her voice was weak, ineffectual. Dad's eyes were cold as he looked at me, really looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. "You've been nothing but a burden since the day you were born," he spat. "Another mouth to feed, another problem to deal with." His words cut deeper than any physical pain could. I looked desperately to my mother, waiting for her to defend me, to say it wasn't true. But she just sat there, silent tears tracking down her face, offering no contradiction. Dad released my arm with a push that sent me stumbling backward. "Get out," he said, his voice suddenly calm, which was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. "What?" I didn't understand. "I said get out. We can't afford to keep you anymore. You're better off somewhere else, anywhere else." "James, you don't mean that," Mom whispered. But there was no conviction in her voice, no move to stand between us. "Like hell I don't," he growled. "The state can deal with her. Or your sister. She's always thought she knew better than us anyway." Before I could process what was happening, Dad grabbed my backpack, shoved it into my arms, and started pushing me toward the front door. I tried to dig in my heels to resist, but I was 8 years old and terrified. "Dad, please, I'm sorry about the whiskey. I'll be good. I promise." I begged, tears streaming down my face. He ignored my pleas, opening the front door and physically pushing me onto the porch. "Don't come back," he said, his words slurring together. "We're done taking care of you." The last thing I saw before the door slammed was my mother's face, tear-stained and hollow, making no move to stop him to save me. I stood on the porch in shock, still clutching my backpack, unable to comprehend what had just happened. This was my home. These were my parents. Parents didn't just throw their children away like garbage. Did they? I sat down on the porch steps, certain that any minute the door would open again. Mom would come out, apologize, bring me back inside. Dad would cool down, realize what he'd done, feel remorse. I waited as the afternoon sun began to sink, casting long shadows across the yard. But the door remained closed. No one came for me. As darkness fell and the October chill deepened, I finally accepted that no one was coming. With nowhere else to go, I began walking. I didn't have a destination in mind, just an instinct to move, to get away from the house that was no longer my home. I wandered through our neighborhood, past houses with warm lights and families eating dinner together. I could see them through windows, these normal families in their normal lives, completely unaware that a discarded child was passing by. The tears had dried on my face, replaced by a numb feeling that spread from my chest to my fingertips. I clutched my backpack, thankful that at least Floppy was inside, along with my school books and the now crumpled birthday invitation. These meager possessions were all I had left in the world. As night fully descended, the temperature dropped further. I wasn't dressed for the cold, wearing only jeans, sneakers, and a light sweater. My teeth began to chatter, and exhaustion made each step harder than the last. I found myself at the small park a few blocks from our house. During the day, it was filled with children on swings and slides, mothers chatting on benches, the normal rhythm of normal lives. Now it was deserted, the play equipment casting strange shadows in the moonlight. I crawled into the plastic tunnel of the play structure, curling up with my backpack as a pillow and Floppy clutched to my chest. And there, hidden from the world, I finally broke down completely, my body shaking with sobs until I had no tears left to cry. The question kept circling in my mind. What had I done that was so terrible that my own parents would throw me away? Was I really such a burden? Was I so unlovable? These questions would haunt me for years to come. But that night, alone in a plastic tunnel in an empty park, they threatened to swallow me whole. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear and heartbreak, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, not knowing what the morning would bring or if anyone in the world was looking for me. I don't know how long I slept in that cold plastic tunnel, but I woke to the sound of someone calling my name. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, that it was my mother's voice coming to bring me home. But as I blinked away sleep and peeked out from my hiding place, I saw a different, familiar face illuminated by a flashlight beam. "Gabrielle. Oh my God, Gabrielle." My Aunt Maggie rushed toward me, her face a mixture of relief and horror. Aunt Maggie was my mother's younger sister, a woman with the same delicate features but a much stronger presence. Where my mother seemed to fade into backgrounds, Aunt Maggie commanded attention. She pulled me from the tunnel and into her arms, her body warm against my frozen one. "I've been looking everywhere for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you hurt? Are you okay?" I couldn't answer. The simple kindness of her embrace broke something open inside me, and I began sobbing against her shoulder. She held me tighter, rocking slightly, making soothing sounds like you would to calm a much younger child. "It's okay, sweetheart. I've got you now. You're safe," she whispered into my hair. After a moment, she pulled back to look at me, wiping tears from my face with gentle fingers. "Let's get you somewhere warm, okay?" I nodded, unable to form words. Aunt Maggie picked up my backpack, took my hand firmly in hers, and led me to her car parked at the edge of the park. She turned the heat on full blast as soon as we got in, pointing all the vents toward me. "Here, drink this," she said, offering me a thermos of hot chocolate she'd brought along on her search. The warm, sweet liquid felt like life flowing back into my numb body. As I sipped, Aunt Maggie pulled out her cell phone. "I need to let the others know I found you," she explained. "Samantha's parents are out looking too, and Mrs. Palmer from your school." The knowledge that people were searching for me, that people cared, was almost as warming as the hot chocolate. I hadn't realized anyone would notice I was gone so quickly. "How did you know?" I asked, my voice small and raspy from crying. "Samantha came by to talk about her birthday party. She saw what happened through the window and ran home to tell her parents. They called me right away." Aunt Maggie's voice was tight with controlled anger. "I came straight over, but by then you were already gone." As we drove to her apartment, Aunt Maggie tried to keep her tone casual, but I could feel the tension radiating from her. "You're going to stay with me for a while, okay, Gabby?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The reality of what had happened was starting to sink in. My parents had thrown me out. They didn't want me anymore. Aunt Maggie's apartment was on the third floor of a building across town. It was small but cozy, with colorful throw pillows and plants in every window. It smelled like cinnamon and coffee, warm and inviting in a way my house had never been. "The bathroom's through there if you want to wash up," she said, showing me around. "I'll find you some clean clothes to sleep in." I stood under the hot shower for a long time, watching dirt from the park wash down the drain, wishing my confusion and hurt could be so easily rinsed away. When I emerged, Aunt Maggie had laid out a pair of her own pajamas on the bed in her spare room. They were enormously too big, but soft and clean. Back in the living room, Aunt Maggie had made more hot chocolate and a sandwich, which I ate ravenously, not realizing until then how hungry I was. As I finished, I saw her pacing her phone in her hand, clearly trying to decide something. "Gabby," she said, finally sitting beside me on the couch, "I need to call your parents." Fear gripped my heart. "Are you going to make me go back?" I whispered. The look she gave me was fierce and protective. "Absolutely not. Not tonight, not ever, if that's what you want. But I need to talk to them, to understand what happened and what happens next." I nodded, relief flooding through me. Aunt Maggie squeezed my hand before standing and moving to the kitchen to make the call. She tried to keep her voice down, but the walls in the apartment were thin, and her anger made her volume rise despite her efforts. "What the hell were you thinking, Diana? She's 8 years old." Aunt Maggie's voice was trembling with rage. "I found her sleeping in a park, Diana. A park. Do you have any idea what could have happened to her?" There was a pause as my mother responded, her words inaudible to me. "Don't give me that crap about James being drunk. Being drunk doesn't excuse throwing your child out like garbage." Another pause. "No, she's staying with me tonight. And tomorrow night too, from the sound of it." I could hear my aunt's breathing, trying to control herself. "Actually, Diana, I'm calling social services in the morning. This isn't the first time, just the worst. I've looked the other way too long." The silence that followed that statement seemed to stretch forever. Then Aunt Maggie's voice, lower but no less intense. "If you and James don't want her, fine. I'll take her. But don't think for a second I'm going to let this go." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, her back to me, shoulders tense. When she turned around, she had composed her features into a calm expression that didn't quite mask the storm beneath. "Your mom says you can stay here for now," she said simply, not sharing the rest of the conversation. "They don't want me back, do they?" I asked, my voice small. Aunt Maggie came and sat beside me, taking both my hands in hers. "Gabby, listen to me. What happened today has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. Your parents are dealing with a lot of problems. problems that adults should never put on their children's shoulders. But if I hadn't broken the whiskey bottle— "No," she said firmly. "Don't you dare blame yourself. Adults don't throw children out for accidents. What they did was wrong, deeply wrong, and it's not your fault." That night, I slept in Aunt Maggie's spare room, Floppy clutched tight against my chest. Despite the comfortable bed and warm blankets, I woke repeatedly from nightmares where I was falling, always falling, with no one to catch me. The next day, a social worker named Ms. Jenkins came to talk to me. She had kind eyes and spoke to me directly, not over my head like many adults did with children. She explained that she was there to make sure I was safe and to help figure out what would happen next. "Sometimes parents need help learning how to take care of their children properly," she explained, "and sometimes children need to stay somewhere else while their parents get that help." Later that day, Aunt Maggie took me back to my parents' house to collect some of my things. My heart pounded as we approached the door, but neither Mom nor Dad was home. Anthony let us in, his eyes red-rimmed and guilty. "I'm sorry, Gabby," he whispered as I passed him, but he offered no other explanation or comfort. I packed clothes and books, my few toys and treasures into garbage bags that Aunt Maggie had brought. The task felt surreal, like I was moving through a bad dream. This was my room in my house, but suddenly I was a visitor, an outsider collecting artifacts from a life that no longer existed. As days turned into weeks, a new routine began to form. Aunt Maggie enrolled me in a school closer to her apartment. She rearranged her work schedule at the hospital where she was a nurse so that she could drop me off and pick me up. We ate dinner together every night, and she always asked about my day, actually listening to my answers. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could erase the abandonment I had experienced. But for the first time, I was beginning to understand what it felt like to live in a home where I wasn't walking on eggshells, where my presence wasn't a burden, but a joy. And slowly I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, the problem had never been me at all. The first few months living with Aunt Maggie were a period of adjustment filled with contradictions. There was the relief of safety, of regular meals, and a quiet home, but also the deep ache of abandonment that no amount of comfort could fully soothe. Starting at a new school mid-semester brought its own challenges, especially when curious classmates asked innocent questions about my family. "Why do you live with your aunt? Where are your mom and dad? How do you explain to other 8-year-olds that your parents threw you away?" I developed a simplified narrative. "My parents are having some problems, so I'm staying with my aunt for a while." The explanation seemed to satisfy most kids, but it left me feeling like I was carrying a shameful secret. Aunt Maggie enrolled me in therapy with Dr. Sarah, a child psychologist with a soft voice and an office full of toys designed to help children express what they couldn't say with words. In the beginning, I didn't talk much during our sessions. Instead, I would build elaborate structures with blocks only to knock them down with a violent swipe of my arm. "It seems like you're feeling some big emotions about what happened," Dr. Sarah observed during one of these destructive episodes. I nodded, tears forming. Why didn't they want me? What did I do wrong? That was the core question that haunted me, the belief that somehow the fault must lie with me. Dr. Sarah worked patiently to help me understand that children are not responsible for adult behavior, that my parents' actions reflected their problems, not my worth. But understanding something intellectually is different from believing it emotionally, especially for a child whose entire world had been upended. My abandonment manifested in various behaviors that concerned Aunt Maggie. I began hoarding food, hiding granola bars and fruit under my mattress, terrified of being hungry if I was cast out again. I couldn't bear to throw anything away, not even broken toys or outgrown clothes clinging to possessions as if they were lifelines. One afternoon, Aunt Maggie was 30 minutes late picking me up from school due to an emergency at the hospital. By the time she arrived, I was huddled in the school office, hyperventilating, convinced she too had decided I was too much trouble and had abandoned me. It took hours for her to calm me down, holding me close and promising over and over that she would always come back for me. "I'm not going anywhere, Gabby," she said firmly. "You're stuck with me, kiddo." I wanted desperately to believe her, but trust had become a fragile thing for me, easily shattered. It wasn't just trust in others that had been damaged, but trust in myself. If my own parents didn't find me lovable enough to keep, what did that say about me? Who was I, if not the unwanted child? Gradually, Dr. Sarah helped me work through these questions, teaching me techniques to manage anxiety and building my self-esteem through small victories. Aunt Maggie reinforced these lessons at home, celebrating my achievements no matter how minor and providing the consistent care I had never experienced before. As I adjusted to my new life, I also learned more about the complicated relationship between Aunt Maggie and my mother. They were only 2 years apart, but seemed to inhabit different universes. Where my mother was passive and withdrawn, Aunt Maggie was fierce and independent. The sisters had grown distant years before I was born, their relationship strained by my mother's choices and her marriage to my father. "Your mom wasn't always like this," Aunt Maggie told me one night as she braided my hair before bed. "When we were young, she was vibrant, full of dreams. She wanted to be a teacher." "What happened?" I asked. Aunt Maggie's hands paused briefly. "Life happened. Bad choices happened. Your father happened." She resumed, braiding her touch gentle despite the tension in her voice. "But none of that is your burden to carry, Gabby. You understand that, right?" I nodded, though understanding was still a work in progress. The sacrifices Aunt Maggie made to provide me with a stable home became increasingly apparent as time passed. She took extra shifts at the hospital to afford a larger apartment with a proper bedroom for me. She rearranged her social life to be present for school events and doctor appointments. She navigated the complicated legal process to become my official guardian when it became clear my parents had no intention of reclaiming their role. Throughout those early months, the most painful reality was the complete absence of my parents from my life. No phone calls, no birthday card when I turned 9, no attempts to check on my welfare. It was as if I had simply ceased to exist for them, erased from their narrative as easily as chalk from a blackboard. The most significant breakthrough in my adjustment came about 6 months after moving in with Aunt Maggie. We had fallen into a comfortable routine breakfast together before school dinner, with stories about our days, weekend trips to the library or park. One Friday evening, as we prepared dinner together, I was telling Aunt Maggie about a science project I was excited about. "I can't wait to show you when it's done," I said, chopping vegetables with careful concentration. "It's going to look so cool in our home." The word slipped out naturally without thought. Home. Not your apartment, or here, but home. I froze, the realization of what I'd said washing over me. Aunt Maggie noticed my sudden stillness and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Yes," she said softly. "This is your home, Gabby, for as long as you want it to be." That night, for the first time since being abandoned, I slept through the night without nightmares. Floppy still clutched in my arms, but perhaps not quite as tightly as before. The absence of my parents continued to be a presence in itself. Each holiday, each milestone carried the weight of their missing faces. As months stretched into years, the initial shock of abandonment transformed into a dull, persistent ache that would occasionally sharpen into acute pain without warning. A Mother's Day card project at school, a father-daughter dance announcement. These ordinary moments became landmines in the landscape of my healing. But through it all, Aunt Maggie remained my constant, my foundation, the adult who chose me when my own parents could not. And slowly, with her unwavering support and Dr. Sarah's guidance, I began to build a new identity beyond the girl whose parents threw her away. I became Gabby, who excelled at science, who loved to read fantasy novels, who had a talent for sketching, who had a home. By the time I reached middle school, I had settled into life with Aunt Maggie, but the questions about my identity only grew more complex. Middle school is hard enough for any kid, but when you're carrying the weight of parental abandonment, the normal struggles of adolescence take on an additional layer of complication. The question, "Who am I?" that plagues all teenagers, was for me tangled up with, "Why wasn't I enough?" At 12, I looked in the mirror and searched my features for clues, wondering which parts of me had been so unlovable that my own parents could discard me. Was it my father's stubborn chin or my mother's wide-set eyes that had doomed me? What invisible flaw had they seen that Aunt Maggie was blind to? While other girls worried about popularity and first crushes, I worried about being fundamentally defective in some way I couldn't identify. This fear manifested as a desperate need to fit in, to be so normal that no one would suspect the broken pieces I was hiding inside. When I was 13, I decided to write a letter to my parents. It had been 5 years since they had thrown me out, 5 years of silence and absence. With Dr. Sarah's encouragement, I poured my heart onto 3 pages of notebook paper, asking the questions that still haunted me, expressing the hurt and confusion, but also telling them about my life now, about school and friends, and the person I was becoming. I carefully addressed the envelope to the house on Maple Street and dropped it in the mailbox with a mixture of dread and hope. For 2 weeks, I jumped every time the phone rang or checked the mail with trembling hands, but no response came. Then 3 weeks later, the letter was returned, marked, "Return to Sender," in stark red letters. They hadn't even opened it. The rejection reopened wounds I thought had started to heal. I entered what Aunt Maggie later called my rebellion phase, though Dr. Sarah more accurately described it as externalizing my pain. I started talking back, breaking curfew, letting my grades slip. I dyed my hair black, wore dark clothes and too much eyeliner, pushing boundaries to see if Aunt Maggie too had a breaking point where she would decide I was too much trouble. One afternoon, I shoplifted a lipstick from the drugstore, a small act of defiance that ended with a security guard calling Aunt Maggie to pick me up. In the car ride home, I waited for the yelling, the punishment, perhaps even the final rejection I had been unconsciously provoking. Instead, Aunt Maggie pulled into a park, turned off the engine, and turned to me with eyes full, not of anger, but of deep sadness. "Gabrielle," she said quietly, using my full name in a way that conveyed the seriousness of the moment. "I know what you're doing." "I don't know what you're talking about," I muttered, staring out the window. "You're testing me, pushing to see if I'll give up on you like they did." She reached over and gently turned my face toward hers. "But here's the thing, kiddo. I won't. You can push and test and act out all you want, but I'm not going anywhere. There is nothing, absolutely nothing you could do that would make me stop loving you or throw you out." Her words broke through the defensive wall I'd been building, and I collapsed into tears. Aunt Maggie held me across the center console of her car, letting me cry until I had no tears left. "I'm sorry," I whispered eventually. "I know," she said simply. "But Gabby, you have to find a better way to process your hurt. Not just for me, but for yourself." That incident marked a turning point. Instead of pushing Aunt Maggie away, I began asking more questions about my family, trying to understand the history that had shaped my parents, and by extension me. After years of protecting me from painful truths, Aunt Maggie finally began sharing more of the family history. I learned that my mother had grown up with an alcoholic father too, creating a cycle of dysfunction she had never managed to break. I discovered that my father's family had a history of mental illness that went untreated due to stigma and lack of resources. These revelations didn't excuse what they had done to me, but they provided context, a wider lens through which to view the abandonment. Around this time, I found a box of old family photos in Aunt Maggie's closet while looking for extra blankets. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, I sifted through images of people I barely recognized. My mother as a teenager laughing with Aunt Maggie at a beach. My father in his early 20s, standing proudly next to a new car. A family portrait taken when I was about 5, all of us smiling for the camera as if we were normal happy. These photos triggered complex emotions, anger at the facade, nostalgia. For a time, I could barely remember grief for what should have been. I spent hours with those photos trying to reconcile the smiling people in the pictures with the parents who had found it so easy to throw me away. Despite the emotional turmoil of these discoveries, my academic performance suffered during this period. Teachers who had once praised my intelligence and work ethic now sent notes home about incomplete assignments and lack of participation. The energy required to process my trauma left little room for quadratic equations or the causes of the Civil War. It was my English teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, who inadvertently provided a lifeline. After receiving a particularly personal essay I had written about resilience, she kept me after class. "Gabrielle," she said, "you have a remarkable voice. Have you ever considered keeping a journal?" That suggestion led to my discovery of writing as an emotional outlet. I filled notebook after notebook with my thoughts, memories, fears, and gradually hopes. The act of putting words on paper helped externalize the chaos inside me, giving form to feelings too complex to express verbally. Writing became my therapy, my escape, and eventually my passion. By the time I reached high school, I had largely moved past the rebellion phase into something more like acceptance. Not acceptance that what had happened was okay, but acceptance that it had happened and could not be undone. I focused on building the future rather than dwelling on the past, channeling my energy into academics and writing for the school newspaper. The one event that still stung even after years of therapy and healing was my high school graduation. As I sat in my cap and gown scanning the audience for Aunt Maggie's proud face, I couldn't help but notice the empty seats beside her where parents should have been. Their absence was a void that no amount of accomplishment could quite fill, a reminder that even on my proudest days, I was still the girl who hadn't been worth keeping. But as Aunt Maggie hugged me fiercely after the ceremony, whispering how proud she was, I realized something important. Family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who stays when everyone else leaves. The years following high school brought new challenges and opportunities. With Aunt Maggie's encouragement and financial support cobbled together from scholarships and part-time jobs, I enrolled in the state university about an hour from our home. College represented a fresh start, a place where no one knew my history unless I chose to share it. My freshman year, I met Jake in a creative writing class. He was tall and thoughtful with a quiet confidence I found intriguing. We became friends first, bonding over our shared love of literature and photography. When our relationship gradually evolved into something more, I found myself struggling with intimacy in ways I hadn't anticipated. "Tell me about your family," Jake said one evening as we sat on the quad watching stars emerge in the twilight sky. The question was innocent, expected even, but it sent a jolt of panic through me. Over the years, I had perfected a sanitized version of my story. My parents weren't able to take care of me, so my aunt raised me. It was true without revealing the devastating details, the kind of convenient half-truth that avoided pity or uncomfortable questions. But with Jake, I found myself wanting to be fully known, even the broken parts. So I told him everything: the drinking, the neglect, the final violent ejection from my home, the years of silence that followed. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for signs of judgment, or worse, pity. Instead, I saw anger on my behalf and a deep, genuine empathy. When I finished, he took my hand and said simply, "Thank you for trusting me with that." No platitudes about things happening for a reason, no awkward attempts to find a silver lining, just acknowledgement and presence. Jake came from what I considered a normal family, the kind I had always observed from the outside. His parents had been married for 30 years, his home life stable and loving. When he invited me to spend Thanksgiving with them during our sophomore year, I was both excited and terrified. The Garcia family welcomed me warmly, but I couldn't help noticing the easy affection between Jake and his parents, the inside jokes and casual touches that spoke of lifelong security. It stirred a complex mixture of gratitude for their inclusion and grief for what I had never experienced. As Jake and I grew closer over the next 2 years, he began gently suggesting that I might find closure by confronting my parents. "Not for them," he emphasized, "for you, so you can move forward without these unanswered questions hanging over you." I resisted the idea at first. What closure could there be for a wound so fundamental? But the suggestion planted a seed that grew despite my reluctance. By our senior year of college, as we discussed our future together, I realized that Jake was right. If I wanted to build a life without the shadow of abandonment, I needed to face its source. With Jake's support, I used an online search to locate my parents. They had moved from our old house on Maple Street to a different neighborhood in the same town. The thought that they had been so close all these years, living their lives as if I had never existed, made my stomach twist with anger and hurt. The drive back to my hometown on a crisp October day felt like traveling backward in time. Jake offered to come with me to wait in the car if I wanted privacy, or to stand beside me if I needed strength. His presence was a tether to the present, a reminder that whatever happened at this confrontation, I had a future waiting for me. I had rehearsed what I would say dozens of times, imagining every possible scenario. Would they express remorse? Offer excuses? Slam the door in my face? Despite years of therapy and healing, I realized a small part of me still hoped for a tearful reunion, an explanation that would somehow make sense of the senseless act of throwing away a child. We parked outside a modest ranch house with a well-kept yard. My hands trembled as I checked the address one last time. This was it, the moment I had both dreaded and longed for. "You don't have to do this today," Jake said softly, "or ever if you're not ready." I took a deep breath. I need to, for me. The walk to the front door felt endless. Each step required conscious effort, fighting against the instinct to run in the opposite direction. When I finally rang the doorbell, the sound seemed to echo inside me, reverberating through 13 years of absence. The door opened to reveal my father. He was older, grayer, but unmistakably the man who had pushed me out of his life. For a moment, he stared at me with confusion, not recognizing the woman I had become. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something I couldn't quite identify. Discomfort, guilt, fear. "Gabrielle." He said my name, sounding strange in his voice after so many years. "Hello, Dad." I replied the word dad, feeling foreign on my tongue. He hesitated, then stepped back. "You'd better come in." The interior of the house was neat and comfortably furnished, family photos adorning the walls. I scanned them quickly, noting images of my brother Anthony with a woman I assumed was his wife. And then I saw something that made my heart stop: photos of a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, with my mother's eyes and my father's smile. Before I could process this discovery, my mother emerged from the kitchen, freezing when she saw me. She had aged more dramatically than my father, her once pretty face now lined and tired. But it was the shock in her expression that caught me, as if she were seeing a ghost. "Gabrielle," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" The practiced speech I had prepared evaporated. Instead, I said simply, "I needed to understand why." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. My father shifted, looking anywhere but at me. "That was a long time ago," he finally said. "Things were different then." "Different how?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "I was 8 years old." "We were going through a rough patch," my mother interjected, wringing her hands. "Your father had lost his job. We were about to lose the house. We couldn't take care of you properly. So instead of asking for help, you threw me out like garbage." The words came out sharper than I intended, years of hurt sharpening their edges. "We knew your aunt would find you," my father said defensively. "She was always interfering, always judging how we raised you kids." The casual way he dismissed his actions stunned me. In their narrative, what they had done was regrettable, but ultimately justified a decision made under pressure rather than an act of cruelty that had shaped my entire life. Before I could respond, the front door opened, and Anthony walked in with the girl I had seen in the photos. My brother stopped short when he saw me, his face draining of color. "Gabby," he said incredulously. He looked to our parents, then back to me. "I didn't know you were coming." The girl beside him looked at me with curiosity. "Who's that?" she asked, tugging on Anthony's sleeve. My mother answered before anyone else could. "This is a friend of the family, sweetie. Why don't you go play in your room for a bit? A friend of the family, not 'this is your sister.'" I watched the girl skip down the hallway, oblivious to the tension she left behind. "You have another daughter," I said flatly, the realization washing over me. They had replaced me, started over with a new child while erasing me from their history so completely that my own sister didn't know I existed. "Sophia is 10, my mother said, as if that explained everything. "She came along after things stabilized." The implication was clear: after I was gone, after I was no longer a burden, their lives had improved enough to welcome another child. A child they had kept. A child they had not thrown away. I looked around at this tableau of family life. I had been excluded from my brother, now married my parents, apparently sober and functional, a sister I had never met. The life they had built without me, perhaps because they had discarded me. Something inside me broke open, a dam of emotion I had carefully maintained for years. Do you have any idea what you did to me? I asked, my voice trembling. Do you ever think about the fact that you abandoned your own child, that you threw me out like I was nothing? My parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. We made mistakes, my father said stiffly. It was a difficult time. A mistake, I repeated incredulously. A mistake is forgetting to pick your kid up from soccer practice. You locked the door and told me never to come back. You never called, never checked if I was okay, never sent so much as a birthday card. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed more about her discomfort than genuine remorse. What do you want from us, Gabrielle? It was 13 years ago. We can't change the past. I want you to acknowledge what you did, I said. I want you to understand that your rough patch gave me a lifetime of trauma. I want you to tell me why I wasn't worth keeping, but she is. I gestured toward the hallway where Sophia had disappeared. That's not fair, my father said, his voice hardening into the tone I remembered from childhood. We were different people then. We've worked hard to change to be better. Better for her, I said softly, but not for me. The conversation continued in circles, my parents deflecting, minimizing, rewriting history in ways that absolved them of the worst of their actions. Anthony remained silent, shame evident in his downcast eyes and hunched shoulders. This confrontation that I had imagined would bring catharsis was instead revealing an ugly truth. There would be no satisfying explanation, no apology that could heal the wound of abandonment. Eventually, I stood up, emotionally exhausted. I needed to see you, I said, to understand. I think I do now. As I turned to leave, my mother called after me. Gabrielle, wait. Maybe we could… I don't know. Stay in touch somehow. The request struck me as breathtakingly selfish, a desire to ease their guilt without doing the hard work of making amends. I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the monster of my childhood memories, but something perhaps more tragic, a weak, flawed woman, unable to face the consequences of her actions. No, I said simply. I don't think that would be good for me. Jake was waiting in the car, concern evident in his face as I slid into the passenger seat. Without a word, he pulled me into an embrace as I finally allowed myself to cry, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of me. They replaced me, I managed between breaths. They have another daughter, a daughter they kept. Jake held me tighter, not offering empty consolations, just the solid presence of someone who wasn't going anywhere. When my tears finally subsided, he started the car and drove us away from the house, away from the family that had never really been mine. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a depression, unlike anything I had experienced since those first terrible months after being abandoned. The confrontation, rather than providing closure, had reopened wounds I thought had scarred over. I pushed everyone away, including Jake and Aunt Maggie, retreating into a dark place where the pain was the only reality. I dropped out of my final semester of college, unable to focus on classes or assignments. I stopped answering calls, stopped writing, stopped doing much of anything beyond the bare minimum required to exist. The sight of my parents living their normal life, raising another child with apparent competence and care, had shattered something fundamental in my understanding of myself. It hadn't been about their inability to parent. It had been about their unwillingness to parent me. In my darkest moments, I questioned everything: my worth, my future, even my relationship with Jake. If my own parents could discard me so easily, how could I trust that anyone else's love would be more durable? I pushed him away with cruel words and cold silences, unconsciously testing whether his breaking point would come as easily as my parents had. It was Aunt Maggie who finally broke through the wall I had built. She showed up at my apartment after I had ignored her calls for a week, using the spare key I had given her for emergencies. Enough, she said firmly, pulling open the curtains to let light into the room where I had been hiding. This stops today. Go away, I mumbled from beneath the blankets on my couch. Not happening. She sat down beside me, forcing me to make room. Gabrielle Elizabeth, look at me. The use of my full name, including the middle name she had given me when I was legally added to her family, caught my attention. I peeked out from my cocoon. I know seeing them was hard, she said, her voice gentler now. I know it brought everything back. but you cannot let them destroy you twice. I won't allow it." Her words penetrated the fog of depression and self-pity I had been swimming in. Aunt Maggie had never given up on me, not once in all the years she had been my guardian, my parent in every way that mattered. And here I was, ready to give up on myself, because of people who had proven 13 years ago that their opinions shouldn't matter to me. "I don't know how to move forward," I admitted, sitting up slowly. Seeing them with her, knowing they could be parents, just not to me. It broke something in me, Maggie. "Then we'll fix it," she said simply. "We'll get you back into therapy. You'll finish your degree. You'll apologize to that young man who loves you and who you've been treating terribly. And day by day, we'll rebuild." Her certainty was a lifeline, a reminder that I had overcome the original abandonment and could overcome this aftershock as well. That same day, I showered for the first time in too long, called my academic advisor to discuss returning to school, and reached out to Dr. Sarah to resume therapy. The hardest call was to Jake. We had spoken only briefly in the weeks since the confrontation, my responses to his concerned messages growing increasingly curt until they stopped altogether. I expected anger, or worse, indifference. Instead, he answered on the first ring, relief evident in his voice. "Gabby," he said simply, "I've been so worried." "I'm sorry." I whispered the words inadequate for the hurt I had caused. "I pushed you away because I was scared." "I know," he replied, "and I'm still here." That was the beginning of my second healing journey, in many ways more difficult than the first, because I was now old enough to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had been done to me. With professional help, the support of Aunt Maggie, and Jake's patient love, I gradually found my way back to myself. I returned to school, completing my degree in psychology, with a new purpose to help other children who had experienced abandonment and trauma. The confrontation, painful as it had been, had freed me from the fantasy that there was a neat explanation waiting for me, a key that would unlock the mystery of why I hadn't been lovable enough to keep. The truth was messier and simpler. My parents' failings had never been about me at all. The years that followed my confrontation with my parents were a time of profound healing and redefinition. With Aunt Maggie's unwavering support and Jake's patient love, I slowly rebuilt myself from the foundation up, no longer defined by abandonment, but by the connections I chose and the life I created. I graduated with my psychology degree a semester late, but with a clearer sense of purpose than many of my peers. My thesis on resilience in children who had experienced family trauma earned departmental honors, drawing from both academic research and my personal journey. Dr. Sarah, who had guided me through the darkest periods of my childhood, attended my graduation alongside Aunt Maggie, her presence a reminder of how far I had come. After graduation, I secured an internship at a center for foster children, working with kids who, like me, had experienced the profound disruption of family breakdown. Each child I met reflected some aspect of my own story: the hoarding of food, the fear of attachment, the desperate need to understand why they hadn't been worth keeping. But in helping them, I found that my own wounds continued to heal. "You're good with them," my supervisor commented one day after watching me work with a particularly withdrawn 7-year-old boy. "You speak their language." "I was them," I replied simply. My relationship with Jake deepened as we navigated the complexities of building a future together. He never pressured me to get over my past or minimize the impact of my ongoing healing journey. Instead, he became my partner in creating new, healthier patterns of attachment and trust. When he proposed on a quiet evening at home, rather than in a public spectacle, I knew it was because he understood my need for emotional safety. "I want to build a family with you," he said, "one where everyone knows they belong no matter what." Our wedding was small but meaningful, held in the botanical gardens where Aunt Maggie had often taken me for peaceful afternoons during my tumultuous adolescence. As I prepared in the bridal room, I felt a momentary pang at the absence of traditional family. There would be no father to walk me down the aisle, no mother to help adjust my veil. Aunt Maggie, sensing my thoughts, took my hands in hers. "Families come in all forms, Gabby," she said. "Look at the people out there. Every single one of them chose to be in your life, and you chose them back. That's more meaningful than any accident of birth." She was right. The guests waiting in the garden represented a chosen family, built over years, friends who had stood by me, professors who had mentored me, colleagues who respected me, children I had helped, who were now thriving teens. And at the center, Aunt Maggie herself, who had become more mother to me than the woman who gave birth to me had ever been. It was Aunt Maggie who walked me down the aisle, both of us teary-eyed but smiling. As I joined hands with Jake, exchanging vows to cherish and support each other, I felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle from that terrified 8-year-old huddled in a park to a woman capable of giving and receiving love without fear. Our early married years brought new challenges and joys. We bought a small house, adopted a rescue dog named Scout, and built careers helping others. Jake's photography business focused on family portraits that captured authentic moments rather than posed perfection. My work with foster children expanded to include training for foster parents and developing trauma-informed care protocols. The question of having our own children was complex for me. The fear of repeating patterns ran deep despite all my therapeutic work and intellectual understanding that I was not doomed to become my parents. "What if it's in my blood?" I asked Jake one night as we discussed starting a family. "What if I don't know how to be a good mother because I never had one?" "That's not how it works," he said gently. "You've spent years learning about healthy attachment and development. You've helped dozens of traumatized kids heal. And most importantly, you're aware of the patterns you don't want to repeat. That awareness alone puts you miles ahead." When our daughter Lily was born 2 years later, the moment they placed her in my arms triggered both immense joy and unexpected grief. Looking at her perfect face, I couldn't comprehend how anyone could abandon their child. The love I felt was so immediate and overwhelming that it made my parents' actions even more incomprehensible. Motherhood became both a healing journey and a chance for redemption. Each time I soothed Lily's cries, prepared her meals, read her stories, or simply held her close, I was creating the childhood I wished I'd had. The cycle of abandonment that had defined my family for at least 2 generations ended with me. It was during this period of newfound contentment that an unexpected connection from the past emerged. 5 years after our confrontation, I received a message from Anthony, my brother, asking if we could meet. My initial reaction was resistance, the hurt still raw despite the passage of time. But curiosity and a sense that this was another step in my healing journey led me to agree. We met at a cafe halfway between our homes, the awkwardness palpable as we sat across from each other, 2 adults with shared blood, but little shared history. Anthony had aged into a serious man with kind eyes and nervous hands that fidgeted with his coffee cup. "Thank you for meeting me," he began. "I've wanted to reach out for years but didn't know if you'd want to hear from any of us." "Why now?" I asked directly. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Dad passed away last month. Heart attack." He studied my face for a reaction, but I felt surprisingly little at the news. "Before he died, we talked about you, about what happened. I think he had regrets, though he never knew how to express them." "That doesn't change anything," I said quietly. "No, it doesn't," Anthony agreed. "But I have my own regrets. I was 12 when they threw you out, old enough to know it was wrong, but too scared to stand up to them. I've carried that guilt for 20 years. As he spoke, I saw the boy he had been, frightened and conflicted, doing what children often do in dysfunctional families, keeping his head down to survive. It didn't excuse his silence then, or in the years that followed, but it made it more understandable. "They told Sophia about you," he continued. "After you visited, she had questions about who you were, and for once they told the truth, or some version of it. She knows she has a sister." The knowledge that my existence was no longer a family secret, that the sister I had never known now knew about me, stirred complex emotions. Not hope for a relationship necessarily, but perhaps closure of a kind. "They never changed Gabby," Anthony said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Not really. Dad stayed sober longer stretches. Mom found some backbone eventually, but fundamentally they remained the same damaged people. The difference with Sophia was timing and circumstances, not some special love they had for her that they didn't have for you." His acknowledgement of this truth, the thing I had most needed to hear during our confrontation years ago, loosened something inside me. The validation that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated the wrongness of what had happened, that even their son recognized, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or for you to have a relationship with any of us," Anthony said as our meeting drew to a close. "I just wanted you to know that what happened to you was never your fault. Never. And I'm sorry I didn't protect you." We parted with an awkward hug and no promises of future contact, but the encounter left me with a sense of peace I hadn't expected. It wasn't about forgiveness, exactly a concept I had struggled with in therapy for years. It was about finally fully accepting that the abandonment had never been about my worth as a person. In the months that followed, I found myself drawn to a project I had contemplated for years, but never found the courage to begin writing a letter to my 8-year-old self. Not for publication or for therapy, but as a healing ritual, a way to honor the child I had been and the woman I had become. Dear 8-year-old Gabrielle, I wish I could wrap my arms around you as you sit in that plastic tunnel at the park, cold and terrified and so confused. I wish I could tell you that this terrible night is not the end of your story, but the beginning of a different one than you imagined. I won't lie to you. The road ahead is hard. There will be nights you cry yourself to sleep, days you question your worth, years you spend trying to understand why they didn't love you enough to keep you. There will be times you push away good things because you're afraid they too will disappear. But here's what you don't know yet. You are not defined by their abandonment. Their failure to love you properly says everything about their limitations and nothing about your worthiness of love. Aunt Maggie will become your rock, your safe harbor, your true parent. She will teach you what unconditional love looks like in practice, not just in children's stories. You'll learn that family can be chosen built through love and commitment rather than merely blood. You'll meet a man who sees all of you, even the broken parts, and loves you not despite them, but as an integral part of who you are. You'll have a daughter who will never know what it feels like to be unwanted or discarded. Most importantly, you'll help other children who, like you, are wondering what they did wrong, why they weren't enough. You'll use your pain as a bridge to their healing, and in doing so, heal yourself. So yes, tonight is awful. It's unfair and cruel, and no child should ever experience what you're going through. But I promise you, with absolute certainty, that you will not just survive this. You will transcend it, with all the love you deserve, your future self. Writing those words was cathartic, a declaration of both what had been lost and what had been found in the aftermath. I sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in a memory box for Lily to read someday, when she was old enough to understand the complexities of family loss and resilience. As I approach 30, I can look back at the arc of my life with a perspective I never thought possible in those dark early days. The abandonment that once seemed like it would define me forever has become just one chapter in a much larger story, important but no longer all-encompassing. I found peace not in forgiveness or understanding, but in creating a life so full and rich that the absence at its beginning no longer overshadows the abundance that followed. I found healing not by forgetting the past, but by transforming it into purpose, using my experience to guide others through similar darkness. Most importantly, I discovered that while we cannot choose the circumstances of our beginnings, we have immense power in shaping what those circumstances mean to us and how they influence our journey forward. Family, I learned, is not just who raises you or whose blood you share, but who shows up, who stays, who makes you feel valued exactly as you are. So if you're watching this and your story includes abandonment or rejection, or any of the many ways families can wound us, know this: that wound need not define you. You can build a life of connection and meaning, crafted with intention, rather than inherited by chance. You can create the family you needed, but never had. And in doing so, you can transform your pain into something meaningful, even beautiful. Have you found healing from family trauma? Share your story in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if this resonated with you. And remember, the family you create can be more powerful than the family you were born into. Thank you for listening to my story.